Welcome to Theater Talk. I'm Michael Riedel of the New York Post.
And I'm Susan Haskins.
We're going to get an outsider's perspective on the New York theater. A very good friend of mine, esteemed critic in London, Charles Spencer of the Daily Telegraph, is here sort of doing his tour of duty, checking out some of the shows. I'm sure he'll also have insights for us on what's going on in the London theater. And I want to welcome Charlie Spencer to Theater Talk.
Hi there, Michael. Great to be here.
And welcome to New York. All right, Charlie, when you're, doing your scouting out here, the plays in New York for your paper back in London, what to you is the biggest difference between the New York theater world and the London theater world?
Well, they're getting more and more similar.
Yeah.
I mean, what the big difference used to be is that it was all musicals here, but we still had a lot of plays in the West End, which is our commercial centre and the sort of equivalent of Broadway. But that's really going. There was a point in the summer where they were down to, I think, 6 plays in the West End, which is the lowest it had ever been, and the musicals have absolutely taken over. And it's very interesting. Everything that happens here is now happening in London.
And vice versa. All of the big national hits of the National Theatre come here.
Yeah, that's right. And I think also the thing that makes it sort of really depressing in a way, I think both here and there, is this extraordinary thing of every new show has to be an old film. And we've just had Hairspray opening rather late in London. I'm coming over. My main reason to be here is to review Young Frankenstein, which was a big hit in London and an even bigger hit here. But it does seem a bit of a shame that every show, the idea of someone writing an original musical, based perhaps on a novel or something, as the great Rodgers and Hammersteins often were, but just plundering a movie for a musical and adding a few songs seems to me to be a rather
depressing.
Depressing, and it's kind of easy. It's too easy, isn't it? And it's also, I mean, the biggest hit in London, I mean, the absolute sort of roaring hit is Dirty Dancing.
Which is supposed to be unspeakably bad.
Unspeakably awful. I didn't see it. I was away, and I keep thinking, well, I ought to, and everyone says, no, don't see it, don't. But it's actually doing as well as The Sound of Music, probably better, and will run for much longer.
Well, but isn't it, at least here in the New York theater, I know that there are some theater writers who often confuse whether the box office is doing well with aesthetic quality. And so a hit is merely termed, is it selling lots of mugs and bringing in lots of tourists?
Yeah. The musical seems to me, and it really does seem to me to be in crisis, really. I would say the last masterpiece of musicals. I mean, and I think it's your great art form. It's jazz. I would say jazz and the musical are the two art forms that America invented. I would say that the last truly great American musical can stand with all the others is Sondheim's Sweeney Todd, which is what, almost 30 years ago.
Well, I wouldn't
now.
go that far, but
Well,
I mean, I think you're cutting some short.
It's in the same league as those.
Yeah.
I have to ask you, have you seen Spring Awakening, though? That's a show that we're very fond of.
No, I thought that was tremendous. Yeah. Absolutely tremendous. And that was so fresh, wasn't it? And really daring. And is that doing well? I remember last time I was here, I read your column on it, and you were saying, Broadway really is dead if this show is not going to survive. I think it was in previews at that stage.
Yeah, well, it was slow going for a while, but the win of the Tony Award helped, and word of mouth caught up with it. So it's doing well. It's not, though, it's not a smash hit like Wicked, for example.
But nor was Sweeney Todd.
No, but it's certainly not like Dirty Dancing.
No.
I'm curious. Whenever I'm in London, I'm struck by one thing. You have really some of the great theater in the world at places like the Donmar Warehouse, the Almeida, the National, cheek by jowl with this absolute drivel in the West End, like Dirty Dancing or Saturday Night Fever or Fame running all the time. Are there really two separate theatre worlds in London now?
There are, and it's a weird thing because it's this whole principle of subsidy. I mean, if I was a commercial producer in London, I would be sort of A, wanting to slit my wrists, and B, angry. Because basically the National Theatre now gets several million, a lot of millions of pounds. I don't know exactly how much. They can offer the best seats in the house for this thing called the Travel X £10 season.
For £10
£10 for the best seat in the house. Yeah. For productions which they've got extra money to put on. How is a commercial management expected to cope with that? There's a long an old veteran producer in London called Duncan Weldon who put on a good play this year with David Suchet called The Last Confession, a sort of Vatican thriller, really, if you can imagine such a thing. And it did okay, but that was about the only sort of serious straight play in the West End worth seeing at that time.
So the West End has become the stuff for the tourists, and the National's
for the tourists and for musicals, and to make, and I'm sure you have the same saying here. In the West End, you can't make a living, but you can make a killing.
Exactly.
And you make the killings with musicals that take off, or sort of tiny little shows. Another show that's done astonishingly well in London and is coming here. Little three-hander comedy, 39 Steps, based on the Hitchcock film.
The John Buchanan novel, originally.
Yeah, John Buchan novel, and then a famous Hitchcock film with Robert Donat. And it's just a send-up by a man who used to be in this sweet little company called the National Theatre of Brent, which was a two-man company with delusions of grandeur, and it's sort of a satire of Amdram's, really. And it's a lovely little show, and it's done fantastically well.
But now, going back to the £10 tickets, which is $20. American,
yeah, $20.
Right? So who's offering those?
That's at the National Theatre.
So that's a wonderful thing.
It's not every show at the National Theatre, but they do a 6-month season, and all the shows in the main house at the National, which is the Olivia, are £10 a ticket for 2/3 of the
So why can't the public theatre offer a $20 ticket?
Because they haven't been able to find someone as big as this bank to underwrite all these tickets. You know, I mean, we don't have the same, tradition of corporations giving that much. It's a huge amount of money that the bank gave the National Theatre to underwrite this program.
It's millions and millions of pounds, but I mean, it's done them a lot of good. I mean, I think we always mention the great thing about sort of art sponsorship, which was a big thing in England, and it's still going on, but is that because it's so generous, we always call it the Treble X £10 season now. You know, which is not something that always happens. You know, sponsors always want to be mentioned.
Right.
This seems such a good sponsorship that they tend to get the mention, which means it's
but maybe that increases their business.
Yeah, and it gives them a very nice image, doesn't it? I mean, because basically the National is such a success story in England, to be associated with that can't help but.
Right.
So you big bankers out there take heed, right?
And the National Theatre is being run quite brilliantly, I think, by Nicholas Heitner. But you had a fight recently with Nick Heitner after a review you wrote of a play called...
It was called A Matter of Life and Death. And it
based on the old Powell Pressburger movie?
With David Niven in it, that's right. It wasn't just me, it was all the sort of daily critics gave it, not all of them, but most of them, gave it a bit of a pasting, because it was a much-loved film, this, a very special film indeed, I think, a very beautiful, odd, quirky English film, and it had been taken over by this company called Knee High, run by Emma Rice, and given a sort of very kind of modernist physical theatre slant, you know, and sort of sent up a bit. And they're about to do the same company. There's going to be another row soon, I fear. But maybe it'll be wonderful, because they're about to do the same thing with Brief Encounter. We're waiting for that with bated breath. Anyway, so basically, we all gave it it got pretty trashy reviews. It got better reviews in the Sundays, largely from women critics. Anyway, Heitner took this and sort of laid into the male critics.
Let me read the quote from Heitner. He called you a bunch of dead white males who are deeply prejudiced against lesbians and experimental theatre. Is there something to this charge, Charlie?
No, I don't think there is at all. I mean, I think, I don't know where he got the lesbian thing from. I really don't. And in fact, there was a bit of a row about it at the time, because I don't think Emma Rice, who directed this play, is a lesbian anyway. And so what if she is? You know, that really doesn't come into it. But I think he has actually apologised, sort of, since. We had some of the older critics, it was particularly the people we've got quite a couple of critics, distinguished critics, who are now beyond the age of retirement.
So we apologise for calling you dead.
It was dead. It was the age thing that really got to people, rather than the homophobic thing, which we all just thought was ridiculous. Because in fact, actually, I mean, I would think I'm one of the very few critics in England who's on the right rather than the left. Yeah. And so, I mean, I don't mind being called these things at all, but they got but he couldn't have attacked a nicer group of sort of earnest, well-meaning people.
Lefties.
So it was a kind of it caused a real storm in the teacup, and we all had to write about it and say we're not dead and we're not.
And what was your response?
Well, I think my response was that it was. First of all, it was his first miscalculation since he had become director, because he's been fantastically successful. And he took over from Trevor Nunn, who directed brilliant productions but bored everyone really to death whenever he opened his mouth, you know, which he did interminably. So, no, we all liked him. And it just seemed a bit unfair, really. But on the other hand, I always think, you know, all publicity is good publicity. I think, you know, and I think it's really great that he felt able to do that and confident enough in himself to be irritated. And you know, he was disappointed by reading these reviews. A man from the Times in London happened to see him that Friday when all the reviews had come out, and he was caught on the raw. And good for him, I say. I mean, there's certainly no grudge on my part, and I don't think on anyone else's now.
In this country, in New York, there's a lot of critics. The majority of the critics are white men, and a fair amount of them are like I am, over 50, and
Fair amount
very
of them
few
are
people,
over 80.
and very few women, very few people of color, and one could argue that there's a singular perspective being represented. But then on the other hand, some could argue that yes, but it's a literate perspective, and some of the younger people coming in and who are championing certain kinds of experimental theater, if what you just described, if that one is how it is, that really is no longer quality theater, and that people, the younger critics, really don't know what good theater is anymore.
It's an interesting one, that. I'd almost put it the other way round, because we have quite a lot of very good, what we call physical theatre now. It tends to be one phrase for it, or experimental theatre. Not necessarily the sort of stuff that the Wooster Group's been doing, which is sort of very up itself and sort of intellectual. I can't bear them. But there's been a lot of very interesting, work on the fringe. And I think and a lot of a lot of it grew out of mime. We've got a company called Complicité. We started as a very funny mime troupe, and now devise shows of great intelligence and beauty using all kinds of technical resources. And I think there is a feeling amongst some of those practitioners who are doing very high-scale work and taking it into new areas, that some of the older people aren't actually together with this. And there's an interesting case is that Michael Billington, who's one of the most senior critics in England, probably the most influential of them all, who's just written this book about the theatre, and it's absolutely centred on the writer, the dramatist, as being the key man in the theatre. This is a study of British theatre since the Second World War, and he makes no apologies for it. He says the writer is at the centre. Well, a lot of these new groups, the writer isn't at the centre anymore.
Not at all.
And I think that
there's no text.
There's no text, or the text is devised in the course of the run. And I think really what Heitner was saying is that we do need younger voices, fresher voices, alternative voices, as well, perhaps, as these sort of old men like me and others who come up doing English at Oxford or Cambridge, have a very literary take on the theatre. And it's interesting. I think there's also a big divide amongst our lot, because musical, the sort of absolute hegemony of the musical is quite recent in England. A lot of our people aren't necessarily particularly literate about musical theatre either. I happen to love it because I did 2 years on the stage, which is our sort of equivalent of variety, rather amateur variety.
Oh, really? You were tapping and singing?
And I used to go to talent contests and on the end of the pier in Skegness and things like that, and I love all that kind of stuff. But a lot of people don't know about that side of the theatre at all. So I think, it started an interesting debate. And it was rather wonderful, because then Heitner wrote another piece after apologising to us all. He said, I wish they'd get out more and see other stuff.
Well, another, though, big difference, I think, between the New York and London theatres, that our theatre still is dominated critically by one voice at the New York Times. It was certainly very powerful when Frank Rich was in the job. Not quite so powerful Ben Brantley, but he still is the most powerful guy in the pack. Your power is really diffuse, right?
Oh, it is, yes, which I find quite a relief, actually. In fact, our power is so negligible that there was a show called We Will Rock You by Queen, a jukebox musical of Queen songs, and without exception, it got the most venomous notices of any show I can remember.
I assume that's why it's not here.
No, it's not here, but it's entering its 6th year in London. I couldn't believe that. And I had one of the great experiences of my life, actually, where I was sitting, there's a tiny little theatre in London called The Bush, and it only seats about 200, and you're on these sort of tiny little benches, it's not even seats. And there were 2 people behind me talking about it. And I can't use the word which was used to describe me, but there was that star Spencer said he wouldn't have a bloody record by Queen on his shelves, and they're sending that kind of creep out to review it. And these were 2 people with money in the show, and I was so proud about that.
But you once told me also that there's something maybe about the British mentality which undercuts the power of critics, and that if somebody tells you, go see something or don't go to see something, the initial impulse is to say, well, who the hell are you, mate, to tell me to do this or not do that?
I think that's absolutely right. And there are critics who do it in England. You must see this show, or, sell everything to see this show, beg, borrow or steal. That doesn't go down well, I don't think. I hate it when people tell me I've got to see a movie, for instance. I'll make my own mind up, thanks. I don't want to be told you must see this film. And I think there is that. The other thing, of course, with this Queen musical is Queen are just huge for reasons which I cannot imagine in England. But right. I would say largely that's the great exception that proves the rule. But by and large, if the majority of us are against something, then it will probably not do very well. And if we all like something, then it probably will do reasonably well. But it's not a make or break thing, and never has been.
Right. Now, you guys do a review in the old-fashioned way, where you go to the opening nights and file overnight reviews.
Yes, that's
Here in New
right.
York, the critics go 4, 5, sometimes a week ahead, and they have a lot of time to ruminate on the show. Do you enjoy that tight deadline? And how does it work for you? You go to the show and you really jump up the aisle and you're gone?
You
like
do,
the old days?
yeah. We see that they have an early start time. We start at 7, and most of us have a deadline of 11:15 or 11:15. So you go and see the show, and then you don't wait for the calls. You're out. We're out like rats up an alley, as people say. And then you've got the terrible problem of where you actually write the damn thing. I now belong to a club right in the middle of the West End called the Garrick, and I'm allowed to write reviews there. But in the past, I've done it in box offices, in dressing rooms,
really?
in the front of house, in pubs, and it's a nightmare. But it does give you a rush, and my view, we don't write nearly as long as Brantley does. I mean, my reviews are 600 words. But I find writing 600 words in sort of under an hour is great. You get a real rush out of it. And I think there's a kind of freedom in the writing sometimes. You get an instinctive gut feeling and a freshness that I find, I have to say, missing in some of the reviews in New York. I think there's a certain ponderousness, a weighing of this against the other.
And you can tell they've done their research and they've read a lot of books.
It's laboured. And I think, actually, you know, it's, to quote the Stoppard title, at the end of the year, it's only rock and roll, you know. And I think there's I used to hate it, and I still get nervous. If you don't have butterflies before a big first night, you're not doing the job properly. But I do find that rushing out and doing it like that, primitive though it may seem, is kind of what it's at, and that's what. That's what the great critics here would do. That's what Brooks Haskins did it.
And then in that heat of battle, you came up with your most famous phrase of all time to describe Nicole Kidman in the Blue Room: pure theatrical Viagra.
Yes, no, that's quite right. And in fact, that was an afterthought. I hadn't even written it. In those days, you didn't. Nowadays, we do it down sort of, on laptops, and it goes straight down the phone line to the office or a modem. In those days, we still had to dictate our notices down the phone, and I hadn't actually written it down. I just realised I needed a payoff line, and it just sort of came, so I just made it up on the spot. And it's haunted me ever since, particularly when it opened here and they all said, he thinks this Viagra, he must be mad.
So you've been in town for a few days, and I know you snuck in to see Edward Albee's play Home Life. I think it's called Peter and Jerry.
Yeah.
First part's Home Life, the second part is the Zoo Story.
Yeah.
Still writing at the top of his game at 80 years old, Albee?
Yeah, very nearly. Not quite, I would say, but actually we had a big glossy revival with Maggie Smith of The Lady from Dubuque, one of his earlier flops in London this year, which flopped again, and in London, the first time I think Maggie Smith's ever been in a flop in London. There's sort of two Edward Albees, aren't there? There's the one who writes these very tough, visceral, exciting knockout plays, and then there's the rather pretentious Albee who writes these rather poetic sub-Beckettian pieces, and very kind of glossy and empty, I find. There's just a hint of that in the first one. It's about it's about Peter, the man who doesn't speak much in the Zoo Story, and his wife, and what's nagging them, and something's nagging them in their marriage.
That unspoken.
It's not quite an unspoken dread, because it then becomes actually quite spoken, what it is. And basically, Peter is sort of diffident and respectful, and the wife has always wanted a bit of rough in bed, and she's never had it from him. And then and there's this feeling that everything is slightly, the happy, prosperous couple, and it's all going slightly wrong, and they've got these unseen daughters off stage. And there's a moment when he looks out of the window and imagines this great tempest coming towards them. And there's a reason why he is, which I won't give away because it would spoil it, but there is a very strong reason, very powerful stuff, like Albee's writing, like very like what we call the in-your-face theatres in Britain, the sort of really about this moment of violence that occurred in his life, which he can't get out of his head, and that's why he's got this very quiet persona and diffident, and because of shame, I suppose. And then, so from this, imagining this sort of thing, everything going wrong. We then meet him literally minutes later when he's gone out into the park to read quietly after this very unsettling encounter with his wife. And of course then Jerry comes along.
It's not his
and
day.
really makes his day. And actually, I won't of course give away that if you haven't seen it, but it is a play that sort of anticipates the violence of contemporary theatre extraordinarily well, and that sort of sense of wealth and the dispossessed. It's an amazingly strong play. Funnily enough, I met Stoppard standing outside Rock and Roll last night on my way to it, and he was saying what a huge influence this play had been on him and his generation. And I was thinking, it's very early, this play. It wasn't done here till 1960. It was written in 1958.
Yeah.
So it's post-Beckett, but absolutely identical to Pinter. They got there at the same time, those two, him here and Pinter on the other side of the Atlantic.
That violence, that
violence,
menace.
What Pinter memorably called the weasel under the cocktail cabinet. And that's very Albee as well. And I thought it was, the first play isn't quite as good, but it is very strong and unsettling and gripping. The second play is a little classic, I think. And actually, you kind of want a third act, and I wonder if he'll ever do this. I mean, he could turn this one-act play into a classic three-actor, where
Peter goes back and has great sex with his wife.
Yeah, Peter goes home and talks to his wife about what's happened to him, and then what happens then.
Now, speaking of Pinter, you brought up earlier that you're one of the few critics on the right, and Pinter has gone now so crazily far to the left, bashing America all the time. How do you find yourself at odds with most of the plays you now have to review because it's just one anti-American rant after another?
No, because for instance, I do think Pinter has entered the realm, not got beyond the joke, but has entered the realms of being a joke. I mean, I just think what he writes about America is so intemperate and it's just so bonkers. And well,
America's doing its part.
Yeah, I agree. But it's so intemperate, But if you look at the two David Hare plays, I mean, I would say surprisingly reasonable and support. I mean, he was very much a playwright, regarded very much as a playwright of the left, and got in terrific trouble with a lot of my colleagues for sort of being too soft on Bush.
On what? On Stuff Happens?
Stuff Happens in particular.
Great play.
Yeah, I think a great play. And Charles Moore, who was then my editor at the Daily Telegraph, reviewed it as well as we both reviewed it. And Charles Moore was saying that he thought that David Hare was half in love with President Bush, which I thought had fallen for his charm. And they never met, but it was very even-handed play. I mean, I think what made it so interesting that it was so even-handed. And I go up and down with David Hare, but I thought he did very well with that.
And I thought he was quite even-handed, well, to some extent, with a vertical hour, in the sense that he's portraying, a noble side of America, and things have gone wrong in this experiment in Iraq, but the character in that play, the impulse is still noble and good.
Yes, I think that's right. And God, that was such a good performance from Bill Nighy. I mean, I thought it was probably quite a dull play, but that Bill Nighy performance I thought was one.
It was the whole thing.
Did he get the Tony?
Not at all.
No, it wasn't even
nominate him.
No.
But it was in the fall, and I think that the people so disliked the play, they really overlooked that wonderful performance.
I mean, it just was absolutely riveting.
Now, are you known as the right-wing nutcase critic, from the left-wing theatre in London?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I'm tolerated. We all get on remarkably well, really. And actually, I mean, most of them, Billington on The Guardian says he gets more and more left-wing as he gets older, but most of them are sort of liberal, I would say, rather than sort of hard-right. I'm not hard-right, I was sort of Tory anarchist, I suppose.
And Stoppard is conservative.
I don't know. Yeah, he was. He certainly was at one stage, and he did. There was a terrific row when Rock and Roll was first done. It was put on at the Royal Court Theatre, which is the sort of classic lefty theatre in London, and always has been since the 50s. And some of the old guard at the Royal Court, the old directors, were absolutely incensed that that they were putting on a Stoppard play because he'd expressed admiration for Thatcher, and that he had no place in this theatre. And it's true, he had no part in their history, but he wanted to have a play put on there, and why not? It's the great theatre of new writing in England, and he wanted his play put on there. I hope it does well here.
We got to wrap it up, Charlie, but we do have a production coming in the spring to New York from the Chocolate Factory, which is a happening theatre in
Yes,
London.
it is.
A Sunday in the Park with George. Is that a good production?
It's a smashing production. It really is. It's always what everyone always says about Sunday in the Park with George, and what's always happening is the first act's absolutely wonderful, and then the second act doesn't work.
Yeah.
You know, it's set, the first one's Surat, as I think you remember, and then it comes up to the modern times, and all the characters are different. Somehow this one makes it work, and it becomes this wonderful play about art and what art costs. And the designs are simply ravishing. It's all done with a lot of computer effects and videos, and it's absolutely enchanting.
Charlie Spencer from the Daily Telegraph, thanks for being our guest tonight on Theatre Talk.
It's been great. I really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you.
You think human nature is a beast which must be put in a cage, but it is the cage